Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Cultivating Community session. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. Why don't you come on in, grab a seat, grab a friend. As a reminder, please silence your cell phones and mobile devices as a courtesy to our presenters and those around you. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you. Please welcome AACRAO Vice President for Access and Equity, Rosalind Perry.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rosalind Perry, AACRAO Vice President for Access and Equity, and I'm really glad to see so many of you here for this session. This is wonderful. I see all these faces out here. This is wonderful. If you joined us last year, you know we tried something new, a live recording of our Heard podcast, and it was such a great experience that we knew we had to bring it back. So today, you all are not just attending a plenary, you are going to be part of the conversation. Okay? I know. At the heart of today's discussion is a simple but powerful idea. Community doesn't just happen, it's built through how we show up and sometimes show out for each other and for the work we care about. We are honored to be joined by Loki Mulholland, an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, author, and storyteller who brings a deeply personal lens to leadership through the story of his mother, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, and her experiences during a pivotal time in our nation's history. Drawing from his book, Get Back to the Counter, Loki will share leadership lessons that are as relevant today as they have ever been, about courage, consistency, and the impact we can have when we choose to act. And of course, guiding the conversation are our phenomenal Heard podcast hosts, Portia Lamar and Ingrid Nuttall, who will lead us through what promises to be a really engaging and meaningful conversation and discussion. So sit back, settle in, and please join me and our hosts in welcoming Loki Mulholland.
Hello, everyone. Hello, AACRAO community, and welcome to the Heard podcast. I'm Portia Lamar.
And I'm Ingrid Nuttall.
And I would be remiss if I did not mention our other podcast sister, which is Tashana Curtis. And also mention we are not the only podcast. AACRAO has several podcasts. We have Admitted, we have Transfer T, and we have
For the Record.
Yes. So please make sure you listen and subscribe. Loki, thank you so much for joining our community today.
Oh, I appreciate it.
We are so excited to dig into your book, Get Back to the Counter. But before we do, We always like to hear our guests share more about their background. So can you take the AACRAO community a bit deeper into your own story?
Oh, my own story. Well, I never get asked my own story. It's always about my mom's story. So I don't quite know what to say. Well, Loki really is my name. That's usually the question I get asked the most. I'm like, yes, how'd you get that name? And the short answer is my parents were hippies. And people are like, yeah, that's the response. And it's like, no, really, I have 4 brothers: Bino, Django, Jomo, and Geronimo.
Oh, yes, okay.
And we would travel around in a purple VW van. I went to 49 states by car by the time I was 8. So that's hippie.
Yes, it is.
So I went to school at Ithaca College and graduated in 2024. So there's a whole 30-year gap there that if we get time, I'll tell that story, because I know I was talking with Amy over at Cornell about it, and she didn't get the whole rest of the story.
Okay.
But yeah, I do documentaries, and I run the foundation named after my mother, Joan Trumpower Mulholland, to teach others about the civil rights movement and how they can make a difference.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And now we would love to hear your mother's story.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about a lot of her story. There's a lot of amazing events that she was a part of. I used to say that she was like the Forrest Gump of civil rights, because she knew so many of the people, and she was involved in so many of the events and these pivotal moments and changes in the movement. But her story really begins when she's 10 years old. And we're going to show some clips here from the film An Ordinary Hero about my mom and the student movement. And the first clip is actually, I want to set this the stories of growing up in the 50s and 60s under segregation. So if we can play that first clip there, great.
In the 40s, in these German-occupied countries, if a Jew walking on the sidewalk did not get off the sidewalk when a German was coming and take his cap off, he was risking his life. So we had that same thing over here.
I always wondered why I had to go through the back door of the public library, why I could not go into the stacks to get my own books, why I had to go to the colored water fountain.
In Sears, I can remember white ladies and colored women bathrooms. You could not sit at Cress's counters. We used to go downtown and to buy candy or something. We couldn't sit at the counter.
We couldn't even go downtown and eat in a lot of the restaurants downtown in D.C.
Let's say we were supposedly equals. We were being treated that way, and I suddenly off this white person. They had all kinds of things at their disposal to do me in, and there was nothing I could do about it.
He said, you ran that light. My dad said, no, sir, I didn't run the light, it was yellow. Morris, I said to you, you ran that light. My dad didn't say anything. And he looked at us in the back seat, and I guess we looked like a nice little family. And he said, Morris, you like a good, so I'm gonna let you off this time.
It was a separate and unequal society, basically buttressed by local customs and laws.
But that was just the way things were. And you want to go, what do you mean that's the way things were?
I met whites all over who had questions raised. I later met blacks who, when they had questions raised, their parents had to tell them, it may be wrong, but don't you try to do anything about it. This is in God's hands. Here's how you protect yourself. Maybe you shouldn't ride the bus so much if that upsets you.
Your parents did that, but they also told you that it would come to an end. Because it was wrong. Anything that's that wrong can't last.
Yeah, I love that part of the story with Reuben. And Reuben was the first black Supreme Court justice in the state of Mississippi, as a matter of fact. A classmate of my mother's at Tougaloo College. So my mom, when she's 10 years old, every summer they would go and visit her grandmother down in Oconee, Georgia, this old logging town, company-owned logging town. And when she's 10, there's her summer playmate, Mary, dares her to go walk through the black quarters. And this was absolutely forbidden. And of course, they go, right? And my mom sees how black people are living up close and personal this time. And these are now as poor as the people were in Oconee, the whites. Like my grandmother had just gotten running water, for example, but you didn't drink the water that came through the pipes because you still get aquatic life that would come through. But that as poor as they were, the blacks in Oconee were even poorer. These shotgun shacks. And then she gets, and people were disappearing. They didn't want to be seeing these two little white girls walking down the street. And then they get to the schoolhouse, and it's a one-room shack on stone piles. Not a lick of paint, my mom says, and just a pot-belly stove and an outhouse out back. And she said it rattled her soul, and that this was in stark contrast to the brand-new brick school for the white students. This is post-World War II. This is 1954. And so, actually 52. I'll take that back. It's before Brown versus Board. And so she sees this, and knowing this contrast and this policy of separate but equal, she says, this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it. She didn't say, this is wrong, oh well, or can you take care of it? She says, I'm going to do something about it as a 10-year-old. Mm-hmm. And she would get that chance when she goes to Duke University.
I think that's amazing that she had at 10 to be able to say, and I am going to do something about it, instead of saying, what can I do? Someone help me, guide me. So I'm excited to have this conversation. Okay.
So less than a decade later, your mother Joan's journey to a sit-in at the Woolworth counter in 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi came in part via her higher education journey. Yeah. She was enrolled at Tougaloo College, which you mentioned, in HBCU, when she sat at that counter. Mm-hmm. So how have you come to understand your mother's higher education journey as a part of that story? What was the influence of higher ed on her journey?
That's interesting. So my mother actually wanted to go to a small church school oh gosh, where was it? I forget the state, but she wanted to go there because it was where her Sunday school teacher and her husband went. Her Sunday school teacher was John Glenn, right? The astronaut.
Name drop.
Yeah. But my grandmother said, well, no one's ever heard of that school. And she wanted her to go to school of prestige. Now, my grandmother grew up as a sharecropper in Georgia, and so, this was important to her. But as well, she also wanted her to make sure she was going to a safe school, and safe meant segregated. She was afraid she might have a classmate or even a roommate who was black. So she insisted on going to Duke, and my mom said, you know what, if it gets me out of the house and gets away from Mama, I'll go to Duke. Which, for my mom, if my grandmother, if her idea was to keep her away from all this, it was the worst place to send her, because right down the road on February 1st, 1960 is the Greenboro sit-in, the A&T 4 sit-in. Now, let's be clear. I know I talked to some A&T folks here. Yes, it was the four guys who sat down, but it was the Bennett Bells who came up with the idea, okay? So, which is the pattern you'll see throughout the movement. The women get the idea, and the guys get all the credit, okay? So that's usually how it works.
Sound familiar?
Yes. But the next sit-ins pretty much were in Durham. And my mom was invited to this secret meeting at her Presbyterian church. They can't tell people because the rowdies might show up and the school could shut things down and so forth. And it was the North Carolina students North Carolina College at the time, who came and talked morally and legally about the sit-ins. And then, to her surprise, invited them to join the picket line. And so she does, which leads to the sit-ins, I think twice, and the jail twice, and eventually that case leads all the way to the Supreme Court, which would come back to haunt her in '63 at the sit-ins. So one of the interesting things on this, well, the Duke University, first, is beside itself. They can't imagine why a white Southern woman would get involved in the movement. right? And the only explanation they can come up with was that she was mentally ill. So they take her in for mental counseling. And my mom wasn't amused, and she finished her credit hours there, that semester in the spring, and then left, right? Which would take her up to Howard University. Now, that's because the North Carolina college students had said, hey, we haven't heard anything from the Howard group since the founding of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee over at Shaw University earlier that year. Can you go up and talk to them? If they haven't done anything, get them going. So, I mean, I think everyone here knows Howard University, we call it HBCU today. So you can imagine, my mom, all 5'1" of her, walking around Howard University asking where the civil rights group is. But so this gets her there. Now the Freedom Rides, which we're going to jump to, gets her down Mississippi. But on that journey, she sees what happens to, because she knew at this point she wanted to go back to school. And she saw what was happening to Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter Galt down at the University of Georgia. And having to integrate the University of Georgia under court order with the police and the tear gas and everything else that was going on. And she said, integration should be a two-way street. And to quote my mother, it shouldn't be a bunch of black students catching hell. Why don't I go to an HBCU? They didn't call it HBCUs then, but why don't I go to an HBCU? And then instead of just running off and doing it, she, at the next SNCC meeting, probably in Atlanta, she has a conversation with John Lewis, who was the head of SNCC at the time, I guess, and Chuck McDew, I think, was actually. But Chuck and John and so forth, John gets the credit for saying it, but he says, well, why don't you go to Tougaloo, or don't go to Mississippi, right? It's a good idea. Go to Mississippi because they haven't done anything, meaning the sit-ins. And if they haven't gotten started, get them started, right? Which, if you think about it, it's pretty crazy.
Yes.
Let me add a few words in here. Hey, white girl, go to Mississippi and get the black students started, right? Yeah. But that also speaks to the level of trust they had in her, because at that point, she had already done about 3 dozen sit-ins and demonstrations. And then we get to the Freedom Rides. If we could play that video.
This was an idea that caught the imagination of the country. However, the civil rights community thought it was a bit of a lark. They thought, oh, right, we're just going to ride on buses through the South, for a couple of months. It was almost seen as like a vacation. And some of the people who actually participated initially were viewed as, people who were just, slackers. They didn't want to do the hard work of going and demonstrating in front of, hardcore places, so they were just going to take a bus.
I think we knew from the start it could be dangerous. On the other hand, maybe to break the tension, maybe half thinking it, we were teasing Hank and some that, here you're going off on this all expense paid vacation. Good way to end the semester, buddy.
How I spent my summer in 1961, and let me tell you the ways.
They put together a small group of 13 riders, I think it was 13, who left Washington on 2 separate buses, making their way through the Upper South. In the Upper South, they were attacked a few times. A couple of people were beaten up, arrested, most notably in Rock Hill, South Carolina. But really all hell broke loose when they got to Alabama.
And all of a sudden, it made national news, and everybody realized this was not just a walk in the park. This was the next stage of the revolution.
I had already had a taste. I had seen the violence. I just barely escaped the Klan. So I had no illusions whatsoever about what was going to happen next. I didn't know anything about Anniston, Alabama, and then we were told that we are literally going into the belly of the beast. Anniston was a hotbed of Klan activity. And as a matter of fact, Jim Farmer, who was a pretty good stump speaker, spoke that night and told a joke about Anniston in terms of foretelling what we were going to be in for. And he said, there was this bus driver driving a Greyhound bus, and as he got maybe 3 or 4 miles from Anniston, he heard this knock, knock thumping on the side of the bus, so he pulled over, see what it was, and as he opened the door, the Greyhound had gotten down off of the side of the bus and wanted to come inside. And so when he asked, he says, why do you want to do that? He said, we getting ready to go into Anniston. And there are variations of that joke of, he said, one preacher said, Lord, we're getting ready to go down to Alabama and we want you to be with us. And then there was silence. And he said, Lord, did you hear me? I want you to be with us. So he heard that voice, I'll go with you as far as Anderson. So all kinds of joke about how dangerous it was going to be. And surely enough, when we got maybe a few miles outside of Anniston, we'd all had been singing on the bus, and as we did that from time to time, a bus coming from Anniston stopped on the opposite side of the highway, and the 2 bus drivers got out and spoke. And the driver of our bus got back on and looked at us and just kind of smiled. As we got into Anniston, the streets were deserted. No one. And it was telling us, this is not good.
A mob firebombed the bus as churchgoers brought their children to watch the Freedom Riders burn alive on Mother's Day. Riders were able to escape, only to be beaten with baseball bats until the local authorities finally stepped in. Freedom Riders were attacked 2 more times in Birmingham and Montgomery, where it appeared things would come to an end. But a call back to my mother in D.C. to send more riders, and a team led by Diane Nash in Nashville, re-energized everyone. However, my mother and the Freedom Riders were now entering Mississippi, a place many would call the heart of darkness.
Yeah. And so she gets accepted to Duke prior to Tougaloo College prior to that, but Duke would not actually send the transcripts to that school. And so they accept her, anyways. Well, I take that back. It wasn't Duke, it was her high school. Her high school wouldn't accept her transcripts. Duke actually did, but we'll accept you on your Duke transcripts, I apologize. And so she arrives at Tougaloo College, and her presence there is such a lightning rod in Mississippi that the state actually tried to shut down the school, having a white woman on campus, right, with these black men. It was just, oh my gosh. But the school's charter predated the Jim Crow laws of 1890 when Mississippi had rewritten their state constitution to usher in Jim Crow. And so they couldn't do that. It was a private school funded primarily from the north.
This is why we care about students. Just want to say that. This is what students do.
Yeah. Fly bothering me.
It's a podcast, Portia. They can't see the flies.
I can't. So when you say, I want you to go a little deeper in saying your mother being on this Tougaloo campus, and it was but it was teetering illegal, correct?
Yeah.
A white woman could not be seen with a black person, let alone a man. Right. So she was in uncharted territory.
Yeah, it definitely was. And it was, a lot of students there weren't quite certain about her when she got there. One was because she came, they knew she had gone to Duke. They thought, definitely that she had greater opportunities in education. And yet they saw when she was studying just as hard in the library and so forth, late at night as they were, that, okay, she must be all right. And then she comes back. So a lot of times what happened was, with these movements like the Freedom Rides, a lot of people came down. It was the summertime, and that was intentional because you weren't in school. These were students. They would all come down to Mississippi or wherever, do their thing, get arrested, and then go home in time for school. Well, my mom didn't. She stayed. And that's what really made her different to a lot of folks. They recognized her dedication and to see it through.
Now tell us, how did we get to the Jackson Woolworth?
Oh, gosh. Because okay, yeah, we'll have to skip Dr. King and all that. Hate to say that, but we'll skip Dr. King for now.
Said no one ever. But please continue, Loki.
Yes. But we get to the Jackson Woolworth sit-in. And my mom wasn't supposed to be a part of that sit-in. She was part of the conversation, but her role was different. So my mom, there's a challenge with my mom. She's a white woman. And while we see these things that she's involved in, her photographs and such, a lot of times she wasn't involved in much because she could just get people killed. It was dangerous for her to be on the front line. But she did whatever was needed to be done. So a lot of her work actually was secretarial. She could type over 100 words a minute on a manual typewriter, right? And when she wasn't working in the SNCC office or Corps, she was over at Medgar Evers' office, working there for the NAACP. But they cook up this idea. So John Salter, Professor Salter at Tougaloo College, and Medgar Evers, who's the field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. He's basically what we call the Dr. King of Mississippi. They cook up this idea to have this sit-in. And it's very intentional what they do as well, is everyone's sitting at the counter, the initial, sit-in portion that we, you won't see, you'll see here, but the famous photo, you don't see that. But the first three people who are sitting down are all from Mississippi. And that was intentional because Mississippi was like, these are just a bunch of outside agitators. No, these are Mississippians who are participating in this. And my mom was asked to actually, using her whiteness, to stand in a crowd at a different protest down the street. That was a diversion because she could blend in, right? And she would see what was happening and then report back to Medgar's office. And then she goes down to the Jackson sit-in, to what's taking place at Woolworth. You want to play that video?
Yes,
oh, okay.
absolutely.
All right.
This new movement would explode on May 28, 1963, when John Salter and Medgar Evers took the Jackson boycott to the next level. In all, 14 people would participate in what would become one of the most famous and violent sit-ins of the civil rights movement.
I've heard at various times from the reporter, the cameraman, and the son of one of the reporters that this was the most terrifying, frightening event they covered in the civil rights movement. Now, guess they weren't in Birmingham or Montgomery with the Freedom Riders, but they got around, and this to them was the worst.
When the three individuals, Perlina Lewis, Memphis Norman, and Ann Moody, sat down at the white counter, nothing happened. Now, Joan, interestingly, was not supposed to be part of this demonstration.
And he said, well, let's go check in what's happening at Woolworth.
They had no idea that this environment had turned volatile until they walked in the store. And it was right at that moment that a thug, a former police officer, had come in and pulled Memphis Norman, the one black male, off of his stool, knocked him onto the floor, and began kicking him mercilessly. Joan was then stuck in the situation wondering what's going to happen next. Ann Moody had been pulled off of her stool and thrown against some of the counters. Perlina Lewis was also pulled from the stool and was down on her knees right by the counter when the police officer came on the scene. Both of them rushed back to the counter, and so that the demonstration would continue. Joan sees all this and realizes, first of all, she is beginning to communicate with the demonstrators. She sees a man with a knife walk by Ann Moody, and she calls out, Annie, he's got a knife. And all of a sudden she's identified with the people at the counter. Who's this white girl talking to those black girls, So all of a sudden she realizes that she's in danger.
But then I sat down. That's when I became a problem.
She walked through that mob in the Woolworth store. And they realized, of course, immediately where she stood.
She joins Perlina and Annie at the counter, the first white to join the demonstration. And at this The crowd is just incensed. They become like hornets. They start screaming at her.
I went immediately to the lunch counter to sit with Joan and Annie Moody.
When Salter joined, the crowd turned violent. He was knocked in the back of his head with brass knuckles. There was a student who put his cigarette out on the back of Salter's neck. There were several cigarette, and you can still see it to this day. If you look on the back of his neck, he has scars in the shape of a cigarette. They threw pepper and water mixture into his eyes. Things were just going out of control. And at that point, Joan has said that she believed that they were not going to make it out alive. None of them were going to make it out alive.
That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And again, the fact that these individuals did this and had no withdrawal. They stood strong and stood their ground. Can you explain a little bit, this is in the book, but explain the atmosphere and the idea of now that we are like, oh, where are the authorities? They should intervene. Can you explain how that went?
So, so the police were all outside because I mentioned previously in 1960 that Supreme Court case. So that came back to haunt them. So the Supreme Court had ruled that demonstrating is, actually constitutional, right? But that the police just couldn't come in and just arrest people. They had to be invited in by the store owners, and that's only if the demonstrators refused to leave and so forth. And so what ends up happening is the police are just all out there letting this chaos take place, right? And this is a mob of 200 to 300 people at this point. So my mom walks in, she sees Memphis getting attacked. And this former police officer, the police officer was considered too violent for the Jackson City police, right? So he's kicked off the force. That's how bad this guy is. He gets arrested, and so does Memphis. Memphis gets arrested for being attacked, okay? Breach of peace is what they called it. And so my mom walks in, sees what's taking place, sits down. This guy grabs her by the hair, wraps her up, drags her through the mob, and gets outside. And that's where and there's a mob outside as well, and that's where the police are. But the police can't imagine that my mom is the agitator, right? So they arrest the guy for, manhandling my mother. She gets free and she goes back through the mob again and sits back down, right? And that's then John Salter joins because Memphis wanted to be there. But John had said, if you go, you're going to be killed. So John goes instead, and that's when all hell breaks loose, right? They just tear this place apart. And these are 5 and dime type stores. Basically, kind of take like a dollar store and combine it with a McDonald's, right? One side is you can buy supplies and so forth. The other side, you can go and eat, but only if you were white. If you were black, you could buy stuff, but you couldn't sit at the counter, right? And that just wasn't fair, right? That was the law and the moral codes at that time. They said, you know what? No, we're going to sit. And I remember asking my mom very specifically, what were you thinking when they were dragging you through that mob? And she said, just get back to the counter, right? That's where they need to be. The job wasn't done.
I think the first time I can remember seeing that picture was actually in a documentary called Making Sense of the 60s that I watched as a child, probably. And what struck me then and what strikes me now is the amount of history that happens in this short period of time, because we have the sit-in at Woolworths and other things come later. Can you take us through some of the immediate aftermath of that, what's happening in this movement?
So in 63, a lot of people take a look at 63 and they go, the March on Washington, right, for jobs and freedom. But 63 was a very huge year. You had in Danville, Virginia, you had the fire hoses and police dogs. Then you see that happening in Birmingham. Then the Jackson sit-in. 2 weeks later, Medgar Evers would be killed, shot in the back by Byron De La Beckwith while standing in his driveway. And in his hands were T-shirts that said, "Jim Crow must go." After that is the March on Washington. This is the high point. And it wasn't actually, they weren't certain if it was actually going to even take place, because the federal government wasn't sure, how this was going to go down. They had troops on the other side of the bridge, in Virginia waiting. They were actually talking about closing everything up, because there was there's this fear factor. If you get that many black people together, what's going to happen? And nothing happened, right? Except for this peaceful demonstration. But then 2 weeks later would be the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. And we have one more video on that if you'd like.
On September 15th, 1963, tragedy would befall the most innocent of victims in the battle for racial equality, when a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church.
We've all seen the footage of the people getting sprayed by the water hoses and things like that. Well, that was the protests that were going on at that time, and they were essentially being staged from the 16th Street Baptist Church, because it was a downtown church, and they could gather there and then leave from there for their protest. And so that's what was happening. Well, the Klan didn't like that, so what they did is they planted a bomb underneath the steps on the side of that church, and it blew up at about 10:22 in the morning. In fact, these girls were getting ready. There was a youth service that morning, and in fact, the title of the lesson was called "The Love That Forgives." And the bomb blew up and killed those 4 girls.
Time for sadness. There was nothing to celebrate. Glass that we picked up out of the gutters at the 16th Street Baptist Church. The day that 3 of the little girls who had been blown up there were buried. And the police shot over the heads of the people who came out of the church to disperse the mob, right?
We attended the funeral. We were standing outside, and we were going to follow the cortege until Ed King and Diane Nash pointed and showed us the National Guard standing with guns aimed down at us in the streets. The National Guard, who had been nationalized by the President of the United States, had rebel flags on their uniforms. Mm-hmm. And I was holding this American flag, which was not liked. They just fell in love with the American flag recently in the South. And so this flag was a sign of resistance that I was holding. So you could see them standing all up around with the guns drawn.
Where were they, on top of the church?
Yeah, all around.
I didn't look up at it.
And so Ed and Diane said, look, 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 look. The same way they did at Medgar's funeral in Jackson when John Doe came out and started screaming and yelling, said, you must stop because they're going to shoot you, pointing to the guns aimed at people in the streets there on Ferris Street. It would have been like Sharpeville Massacre.
I'm not sure they were going to shoot us.
Oh,
we were standing.
You're not sure?
No, the church, you're talking about during the time the funeral was going on?
Yes, ma'am. They had just blown the church up, Joyce.
Yeah, but
what makes you think they
Martin
wouldn't
Luther
shoot
King was inside,
so
preaching
he was killed.
The funeral.
He was killed.
Listen, let me speak, please. Will you indulge me a little? No, there were a lot of people standing in front of that church. And I don't know whether they were going to shoot or not, but if there was any restraint to be had on that day, they would have had it. We bring from these experiences different feelings, impressions, and so on.
Well, this is reality I'm dealing with.
So I would have been shot too.
Yes, ma'am.
You know what? We will find something to laugh about. That's what we will do. So this is the sad event. But I know that you had a great point that that picture that was found
Yes.
gave proof
Yes.
to what was happening.
Yeah. So when I was making the documentary, I had requested, we'll see if I can get permission from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute to use the Aniston video, the bus bombing video, photo. And they said, oh yeah, sure. I said, well, actually we have a couple other photos, would you be willing to take a look at those? And they sent them over, and I'm like, well, that's Mom and Dory, and they didn't know who they were. And I said, well, I don't know who the other ones are, but my mom can tell you, where did you get this photo from? They said it was from the sniper's nest. And so that was confirmation.
Yeah.
Because my mom, she said, I guess I didn't look up either, right? She doesn't remember.
So when you all get this book, and I do recommend that you get this book, it is layered out in several leadership skills that his mother, Mrs. Joan, pulled from all of these instances that we truly believe can be in our day-to-day in fighting the good fight. And I feel like my favorite takeaway was this quote that said, adapt or quit, but either way, get out of the way of those willing to accept necessary change.
Yeah.
And that really stood out to me. So this is us trying to figure out where we are. If you get this book, you got to figure out where you are. Where are you in the fight?
Right.
What skill do you have that you can utilize?
Yeah. I think too often there's so much to say. There's so much to say. But I think about my mom's story, and I asked her, I said, well, what made you so special? She said, absolutely nothing. So are you a hero? She goes, no. I saw something was wrong and decided to do something about it. It takes all of us to make a difference. We just have to make the choice. And recently, I was talking with her, and she said, I can't do everything, but I can do something, because doing nothing's not an option. We have to find what we can do and just keep doing it. And there's no quick fix. Everyone wants that quick fix, and there's not. Brown versus Board was 1954. The Civil Rights Act was 64. Voting 65, right? So 10, 11 long years of the modern civil rights movement, right? Are you willing to put in that type of effort to make that type of change? Right? And that's really what it's about at the end of the day. But I think most critically, to me, the most important lesson is the one on empathy.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just segued into empathy, and I have a whole question about it, and we also have 2 minutes left.
All right.
So that is my favorite chapter. You're going to be selling books after the talk, after we wrap up here. We're hoping that folks have questions. So start to think of them and make your way to the mics as we kind of bring it to the last question of the podcast. Before we sat down here together, we were talking about this last question and the idea of storytelling. And I said storytelling is part of the work of enrollment professionals. I feel we're keepers of stories, we're keepers of student stories. And I was curious about, with that in mind, as we talked about it, where the academic record is telling a very important story of students' history as they go on to the next thing, so that they can go out and do good work, so that they can employ these principles. So how would you see your maybe approach to storytelling as a documentarian being connected to the work of us keepers of stories as enrollment professionals?
Yeah, well, as a documentarian, that's what I do. And we tend to see the civil rights movement only in these outcomes, right? Or a beginning, like, say, Emmett Till. But, and particularly with individuals, to tell the whole story. There's the story in between all this. Like I said, my mom's story we have at the very beginning, right? She's 10 years old, right? Makes this decision, and then we get to the Jackson sit-in, and there's more. There's the time the Klan tried to kill her and all that sort of stuff. But everything in the middle is so critical. And we don't want to lose that. We don't want that distorted as well. And it's so important to preserve that, because memories fade, right? As we're kind of racing against time on a lot of this in regards to civil rights history, to preserve these stories and to get them right. So I see the same thing, right? It's too easy to go, yeah, there'll be a time. No, there's not. It's in the moment. Preserve those stories, because I think it's also important to understand the journey and where you can, see where you've come from. And when that, yes, you've achieved something, but to remember what it took to get there and that you can do it. We can do hard things.
Loki, maybe your next book can be Don't Forget the Middle.
Don't forget the middle.
Don't forget the middle of the story. Loki in the middle.
Where he at? In the middle.
Loki, thank you so much. I know we have time for questions. We would love to see some folks come up and lend their voices to this conversation and to the podcast. It is always better with you here. I'm looking at 2 microphones, and they don't have people.
Yeah.
And I want to see some people. I know you're out there.
We must have answered every question possible.
Here we come.
And we didn't get to the story that I wanted to tell, but Amy, I'll tell you afterwards. All right, it's the whole cloak and dagger James Bond thing, getting out of Russia.
Hello, everyone. Rock Hall, Vice President, Ithaca College. Loki, good to see you again. We talked the other day, man. It was a pleasure bumping into you on the floor and just having a quick time to chat. Dr. King once said that the greatest threat within civil rights isn't the people with the pointy hats, but it's the people who are indifferent in the middle. One thing that strikes me every time I look at those pictures from the civil rights era, you have the act of aggression in the middle, but there's a wall of people behind them. And the different facial expressions, the indifference, the curiosity. Maybe through conversations with your mother, could she describe the mood or the spirit of the space where you had the actual aggressors in the middle, but then you had just an audience around them just kind of captivated within that moment, and what that must have felt like as she was trying to fight for change?
I've never asked her that. They were just focused on surviving. Like the sit-in, she's like, well, we're all going to die. But I think about as well, to your point, I'm not kind of related to your point that I think I can share for everybody is not everyone can do what my mom did, right? And we shouldn't beat ourselves up for thinking that we can't be out there. Not everyone can be out there. There were plenty of black people that couldn't be involved in the movement. Now, I know a lot of people today go, well, every black person was involved in the movement, right? Well, no, that's not the case. They could have their houses bombed, they could lose their jobs, their lives, and so forth. But people found other ways to get involved. In Mississippi, for example, in Jackson, there were many white, I don't know how, I can't say the number, I'll just say many, but don't assume it's every single person. But there were many white women who couldn't get involved because, their husbands, right, in Mississippi. So what they did was, involved directly, they would actually give the help money to give to Medgar Evers to help that way. They found the ways that they could do things. And we just have to find our way to do something. As long as you are doing something, that's great. Start there. And then if you can, then sure, expand on that. But don't beat yourself up for it. I used to do that all the time, going, well, I'm not sitting at lunch counters like my mom and so forth, but I found my voice in the way that I could do things, which was doing the films and the foundation and so forth. So we all have our lane. Just make sure you're going down it. All right.
Thank you.
What's up, bro?
Hey, team. It must be Kenny.
Yeah, yes, it's Kenny.
All right.
Kenny Evans from Tarrant County College in Fort Worth, Texas. Very riveting story, and something you said really stood out to me is that we're losing that history and time is ticking. In today's climate where the history is being reduced, being hidden, being turned against, how do we continue that story fighting against forces that are trying to erase the story at the same time and preventing people from telling that story?
Yeah. Well, we fight, right? Back to the Dr. King quote from Rock. To quote him again is we have to have that fierce urgency of now. a lot of people don't understand this. So the history of slavery and so forth that we were fed was rewritten in the early 1900s by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So all of our history books, if you grew up, if you're my age and stuff and grew up, you learned that history. That it's the happy slave narrative story, right? But there were people who preserved the proper stories and continue to tell the right story. And we have to constantly be engaged in making sure that the truth is always told, right? So suddenly the 1619 Project happens. And people have this revelation. It's like, no, that's always been there. History's always been there. It hadn't changed. Just obviously our understanding of it has grown, but that truth is revealed, and we see the reaction to that. People ask my mom a lot right now is, do you feel like things are moving backwards, right? And she says, how do you feel about this? She says, well, we're definitely repeating history, right? And there's that negative connotation that we have to that, and understandably so. I said, but let's not forget the other part of history. Those who resisted, those who said, you know what, not on my watch, those who, like Mrs. Hamer said, they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they said, I'm going to do something about it because doing nothing's not an option. We have to remember that part. And they changed history. My mom and her friends, segregation was ingrained. This was society. This was the government, right, sanctioned. And they said, people thought it was going to last forever. My mom and her friends said, not on our watch. And they ended Jim Crow and segregation. So imagine what we can do.
Thanks, bro.
Might have time for one more question.
Because I have long answers?
No,
okay.
That's not what I said, Loki.
Is it?
I could ask the empathy question now.
Ask it.
All right. So we talk a lot on the podcast about, it's going to happen now. We talk a lot on the podcast about allyship and what it means when it can kind of shift into something else and just some of those challenges. And there isn't a specific chapter in your book called allyship, but it's a thread. Right. I think throughout all of the leadership lessons. So what would you like the AACRAO community to consider as the lessons of allyship from the 1960s as we navigate the 21st century, and what does empathy have to do with any of that?
Well, yeah, the reason allyship is not mentioned in the book is because, well, my mom is that kind of epitome of it, even though that's kind of more of a modern term now. I mean, allyship and accomplice and so forth. Sometimes folks will call my mom an ally, and the activists back in the day, they get hot. They're like, no, she was an activist. They were willing to kill her as quickly as they were willing to kill us. She was there doing it. But she never put herself out there in front. She was always invited. It's a constant story as well, and the narrative through there is that the invitation to do something, whether it was joining the picket lines or go up to Howard or, John saying, go to Mississippi, all the freedom rides. She gets a phone call, right? Every single time it was there. But I think the important part as well was that there was that level of trust that they had for her, that she was not going to, cut bait when things got hot, right? She was going to be in the fight, and they knew they could trust her on that level. There was a reason, even though she wasn't supposed to be part of the sit-in itself, she was part of the conversation in the room. Because the question became is like, what's going to happen when it hits the fan, right? Can we trust you with our very lives? And clearly they felt they could. But she has this amazing level of empathy. In the book, we call it compassionate empathy, right? It's not just, I feel bad and I can project project of what it is. It's acting on that, that's the compassion part, actually acting on your empathy. I think there's always a space for us to do that. So I hate telling stories like this because it sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, right? But just recently, I posted a video on Instagram and such of, there's been these videos this time of year, we have these prom videos and graduation videos, and there's this theme that always happens every year. We have prom videos, and there's always these negative comments and stuff, and even a negative perspective on these videos, particularly videos of African American youth doing prom. They call them ghetto proms or hood proms. And there was one particular one that just really struck me because this was a very middle-class family. And when they pan the camera, there's the community's all out. You know, it was like, wow. I mean, look how many people are coming out to celebrate this young man, right? And honestly, I didn't know if it was prom or graduation, right? But it was like, wow. And yet, all these comments were just horrible. So I made a video about it, just saying, you know, let's reflect on what this video is about, right? You know, the pride of the parents. We don't know the circumstances around what's going on in their lives beyond just wanting to celebrate their son, right? But for all we know, this kid could have a terminal disease, and they just want to make the best memories they can for him. But then at the end, I say something to the effect of, consider what it means to them. Think about what it means to them instead of what it means to you, right? And that's what my mom did. She said, she looked at that schoolhouse as a 10-year-old. And she said, it rattled her soul. And, you know, this is wrong. And I'm going to do something about it. Right? And to quote her from the end, we just have to make the choice. Right?
What strikes me about what you said about being invited is that in order to be in a position to be invited, you have to be in community.
Yeah.
And I think that is a lesson for me from the conversation and from your book, is to make sure you are in community to position yourself to be invited to the fight.
Yeah, always be present.
Always be present. Loki, thank you so much
for
being on Heard. AACRAO community, thank you so much for showing up for the conversation. Please visit Loki, buy a book. There are so many lessons in here. Get it for your people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Usually it's this time at the end of the session that I say, oh, my heart is full. I don't know what my heart is right now. But this was like a damn good podcast. I'm taking after the Colonel, y'all. Just an incredible conversation. Loki, on behalf of AACRAO, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our outstanding, why did I call your name? My bad, I'm off script. Let me start that over again. On behalf of AACRAO, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our outstanding podcast hosts, Portia Lamar and Ingrid Nuttall, for leading such a thoughtful and engaging discussion. And of course, a special thank you to our guest, Loki Mulholland, for sharing his and his mother's insights, wisdom, and passion for community and leadership. Your work challenges us to think critically, reflect deeply, and most importantly, take action in our own spaces. I always tell everybody, what do I tell y'all? Closed mouths don't get fed. You have got to do the work. You have got to show that empathy. Don't be silent, because if you're silent, we'll never be able to move forward. This has been a great session, and we appreciate your time and contributions. We are proud to let everyone know that AACRAO is making a donation in Loki's name to this year's charity, One Book, One New Orleans. AACRAO, please give another round of applause to our guests. And before we close, once again, I'm pleased to share that Loki will be in the exhibit hall immediately following this session for a book signing. So we encourage you to stop by, continue the conversation, and pick up a copy of Get Back to the Counter. Thank you all for joining us for this live podcast plenary session. We hope you leave here inspired and ready to continue cultivating community in your own work at your own respective institutions. Please enjoy the rest of the conference.